Hey guys, so this video is just a quick part 2 about Michael Kors's book, The Worldwide Mind, and a little bit about Kevin Kelly's book, What Technology Wants. I picked these two guys because they've just spoke so much about technology and they have very unique visions about the future. Um, I have criticisms of them, but they're more of partial criticisms because I want to emphasize that other people, mystics in particular, throughout the past 100 years, have been speaking about this shift in consciousness, but they don't have a technologized version of it. Um, and I forgot who said this, but when I interviewed Bill Thompson, one of the things he mentioned as well was this guy's quote that first you have the mystics and then you have the politics later on. So it begins as a mystical vision and it ends as a political reformation or something to that degree. Um, and this is one of the reasons why Sri Aurobindo, the mystic Indian East-West sage, or guru, I guess he's not really a guru, but um, spiritual teacher, if you will, he left politics. He was considered, allegedly, he was considered one of the most dangerous men in India at the turn of the last century. And he had a spiritual vision, a spiritual experience when he was in prison, and he left. He left the world of politics. He retired to Pondicherry, and I think in northern India, and he began his spiritual journey of writing these books about the evolution of consciousness and the synthesizing of Eastern and Western philosophy. Um, and what he believed was the spirit comes first. The political and the physical is its echo and shadow. And that may seem derogatory towards daily life and existence and seeing the sublime in daily life and existence. So I would take that with a grain of salt, but the general gist of it is that there are certain things that move us. There are certain spiritual forces that are at work that are beyond just the appearance of things, and such forces influence us. In the same way, maybe that you would see astrological forces influencing us, but I think this is at an even more profound level than that. But they're almost like archetypes and zeitgeists for the age, and even beyond that. Um, so on one hand, we have mystics like that. And on the other hand, now we have, years later, decades later, because Aurobindo wrote The Life Divine, he wrote his books and he wrote his articles and he had these experiences right around 1905 to 1915, 1920. That's sort of the spectrum of time where he really began pouring out and developing into his synthesis. At the same time, we had folks like Teilhard de Chardin, who at the turn of the century in like 1909 was deeply inspired by Henri Bergson's book, um, geez, if I can remember, Creative Evolution. Um, and he had this concept called the Elan Vital. And it was this idea that there's a creative force or will within life, a becoming, a self-poetic becoming within life. Um, that he's not the only one who believed this, but he was popular at his time as a kind of alternative to the social Darwinism and the Darwinism at the time period, which was a little bit too almost barbaric or rudimentary, in which ignored the sophistication of more creative and inward and subjective and cooperative states that were present in nature, uh, perhaps more in line with Goethe um, and some of the other German philosophers who had a less mechanized vision of what nature was, a less impersonalized, yet at the same time, hopefully not as romantic, but simply an alternative cosmology. Anyway, so we have these mystics at the turn of the century, and Teilhard talks about the new sphere, the coming of the global mind. Um, Sri Aurobindo talks about the supramental descent, the descent of the supermind into human consciousness. Rudolf Steiner believed we were at a critical point in the evolution of consciousness where we would be entering into a new age, and I haven't really read much about what Steiner believed about the coming centuries, but he either believed we would slide down into a kind of dark age where we're in a war against all, or would we enter an age of spiritual renewal. And even more contemporaries, and perhaps less on the mystical side, but certainly spiritual, like the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who believed we needed a sacred epistemology, a return to the sacred, um, and a reconnection with the sacred. And then there was Owen Barfield, who believed in what he called the final participation and the original participation. And again, it's this theme of the return to the sacred. Um, and then, of course, in the 1930s to the 1950s, Jean Gebser was developing his thesis in his book Ever-Present Origin, which basically stated that we are at the cusp of an eruption of a new form of consciousness, the integral aperspectival age, and he mapped it through looking at art and philosophy and poetry and science and politics to see how a new shift in our orientation was taking place. So we have all of these people at the turn of the century, first half of the century really, who are talking about this. And then at the end of the 20th century, we have the technologists who come in and start developing computers, start linking up the world, and having these utopian visions of physical transcendence into machines, into literally uploading our consciousness onto computers and living forever and having cyborg bodies that are better than human bodies and so on. I mean, Ray Kurzweil was talking about this throughout the entire 90s, probably starting in the 80s. The Silicon Valley revolution in the 80s, we have this huge cultural shift towards a technological vision of the world. And this shift is still going on. This is a major part of government funding towards AI, especially for the military, is scary enough. But this technological vision, this physical, literalized vision, began with the mystics at the turn of the previous century, and we've come full circle. It's nearly 100 years later, nearly 2012. And instead of that mystical vision being actualized, we've gotten the technologized vision. We have a sort of rudimentary pseudo-noosphere in which we're all connected through the internet and these global communication technologies, but it's not really the noosphere, not like Terad was imagining, not like what he was intuiting. And I think what we have here is a very clear example of how the mystics, the artists, the sages intuit something. They have it. It's either an intuition or even perhaps a mystical vision of something that's going to occur. And that mystical vision is not necessarily, or should not necessarily, be literalized. And then it materializes. It materializes through politics, through events in history, and so on and so forth. Through life, it becomes. But even through life and its becoming, through its incarnation, we shouldn't go, all right, so uploading our consciousness onto machines, that's like the real mysticism, right? That's like the real way we're going to be able to live forever and gain eternity and have multiple lives and things like that. I would say no, no, no. The mystics have said so much more than that. So we have this dichotomy between the two. And I think what the good news is, if studying history is any indication of this process, it kind of comes in punctuations. It comes in bursting forth of creativity and vision and imagination in multiple ways. Because at the turn of the century, there were also amazing inventions. There was Nikola Tesla, there was electricity, and amazing dangers. There was World War I at the same time that Sri Aurobindo began to write The Life Divine. So it's a mix of light and dark, for sure. And the transformations are never just all positive. Unleashed within them are these other archetypes and forces that we have to become aware of. At the same time, the digital age is another one of these. So is this something different than the new sphere? Is this something different than what Teilhard imagined? No, I think if we keep in mind what the mystics say, and we keep in mind what the technologists say, for me, the mystics are kind of in the center. And then we have the technologists and the political theorists, and the way this mystical vision births forth into life. The mysticism is the poetry, but the life itself must go on. The life itself must happen. So this is sort of where I closed the semester at. Like, okay, this is all I know. This is all I know, that we shouldn't literalize what's going on. We shouldn't literalize mysticism into merely the internet, or merely technology, or merely the singularity. Those are literalized versions of what is to come. Now, will there be another eruption in human consciousness? Will there be another shift? I think it's possible. I think maybe to some degree there's there's a cyclic process that happens. And again, this is not scientific, this is more of a poetic intuition. This is more of a creative and imaginative understanding of the processes of history and the play between mysticism and science. But I like to be in between these two worlds, so it's a lot of fun to play with the two and weave them together and see what happens. But we have a time of mystical vision, and then that mystical vision incarnates, it descends, it physicalizes, it materializes. Or like Jean Gebser, what he described as, it concretizes, the concretion of spirit into physical reality. And that's what he actually described as the process of the unfoldment of consciousness. It's the unfoldment and concretizing from a potential to a manifestation. Don't mistake this leaf for the manifestation. See it as one manifestation, perhaps in the same way that the human being is a one manifestation of the divine, one manifestation of the anima mundi, and the events that occur are all parts, but never necessarily the whole. Never literalize something to be the whole story. So this is basically where I'm at. We should not literalize our stories about technology, but see them as expressions of inward states, as expressions of what's going on with human consciousness and what has the potential to actualize now that these states are here. They're kind of like signposts. They're kind of like synchronicities. And I don't believe that the singularity will be the way in which spirit becomes part of this world, or the divine worlds participate in this world. I think that happens with us. And the technologies can help in the same sense that a writing system had to evolve and be invented for the Quran to be written, for the Bible to be written, for the scientific process to happen. All of these things, for art, for science, for imagination, requires a physical template. But this has to shift our orientation of what technology means, to have a physical template. And I'm just going to close right here and say that what Heidegger described as art and poesis is similar to what he used the word techne with. Techna, which is technique, and similar to technology, is a bringing forth, a poesis, a poetry of life, an unfoldment, and potentially a revelation, a spiritual revelation. So if we see invention, technology as forms of art, of creative bringing forth of an inner state, I think that would be far more in balance with spirituality. And we could see these gears and gadgets and electromagnetic sheaths covering the Earth with global communication satellites and everybody talking. We can see all of these things as a kind of expressive, creative play in the physical world of archetype, of principle, of unity. And by doing so, balance ourselves and center ourselves as artists, as poets, and as mystics. And I think actually Daniel Pinchbeck actually brought this up in his 2012 book, describing Heidegger's definition of technology. Yeah. See technology like art. See technology like a performance piece. After you've mastered this instrument that you've developed and invented, you can then weave it together and animate it and bring it to life. Because that is all the technology will be able to do. The only thing it is a kind of inert machine that is brought to life. It's an instrument that is brought to life by the Spirit. The Internet is an instrument, perhaps. The Internet, and more than the Internet, because it is becoming a kind of permeation of information everywhere. This global interconnected age of digital technologies where mind and matter are kind of blending into this ambiguous substance where everything is smart and all the services are smart. This is an instrument for consciousness. This is an instrument for the soul, for the anima mundi, to pour forth and to make art out of life. Just as art itself and life itself is an instrument, an animation of the soul, the breath of God, breathing life into Adam. So If art is seen in the same sense as technology, as an instrument, a bringing forth, then this is wonderful, and technology is wonderful because it can become an instrument for that divine pouring forth. If it's seen as the end in itself, that's no good. That's no good. Um, anyway, so I think that's basically where I'm going to end. Oh, machine comes from the word make, which comes from maj, I think that's how you pronounce it, and magic. So that's another thing. So perhaps the technologists are secret or unconscious magicians. And actually, there's a funny enough, there's a book that just came out called The Sorcerers and Their Apprentice. The sorcerers at MIT, and their apprentice, the machine, the cyborg, the artificial intelligence that they're attempting to bring to life. So perhaps there's more of magic and art and mysticism in technology than we would be comfortable realizing. Anyway, thank you so much. That's the end of this rant.